why don't you lead us out?
So I think let's start then. It's 4:02 and welcome all. So I'm Cassidy, the Director of International Affairs in ASFA and General Secretary Delegated of ASECAP. And I serve also as International Vice President of IBTTA. We had 2 weeks ago our first international meetup meeting, which was a very successful meeting. And this meeting that we have on a regular basis now is to keep and maintain the link with IBTTA and all members, I would say, all over the globe in this critical time that we are living, which is also very challenging for our industry. The coronavirus pandemic is affecting the lives of everybody everywhere, and it has also, of course, deeply affected our daily business. And today is a follow-up of the previous meeting that we had, which was a very successful one. And we had at the end of the last meeting a question which was raised by our Brazilian colleague, which is how toll agency forecast traffic in time of uncertainty caused by COVID-19 situation. So today we have a very good panel of experts who have kindly accepted the invitation, and they are with us to answer this question. And I would like to sincerely thank them for their participation. I would like also to thank Jonathan, who has been instrumental to organize this session, as well as, of course, the whole entire team of IBTTA, Pat, Ancilla, Cheryl, Vanda. Each presenter will take you through a short presentation, and at the end, we will take all the questions, at least the one that we can have. And this session will be moderated by Pat Jones, the IBTTA Executive Director and CEO, and I would like to turn to Pat now. Pat, the floor is yours, and thank you all.
Malika, thank you so much. Thanks for your leadership as the chair of the International Committee, and thank you for your many years of service on the IBTTA Board of Directors and several terms as the International Vice President. And I want to congratulate you as you begin your new venture as the Secretary General of ASECAP in July. So we all salute you and thank you for so much service to IBTTA and the international tolling industry. I want to cover a few logistical issues as we begin. This meetup will last about 60 minutes. You've joined this meetup in mute only, so please remain on mute during the length of the meeting. Get to know your screen. You have view options at the top of your screen. Different options may look better depending on what device you're using, so to watch the presentations. We encourage you to ask questions using the chat feature panel at the bottom of your screen. There's a chat button at the bottom of your screen, and you can click on that and ask your questions. And you don't have to wait until the end to ask questions. You can ask questions at any time, and we'll start collecting them so that we can feed them to the speakers. If you're on a mobile device, the chat feature may be under the More options. We're recording this meetup, and we'll post it on the IBTTA website by the end of today. Well, let me share my screen so you can see our slides. And we'll go into presentation mode. All right. And with us today, we have 6 experts, each who will speak for about 5 minutes. We had a nice rehearsal yesterday, and we trimmed our presentations so that they'll be nice and crisp and within that 5 minutes. And here's your panel of experts. David Roy is the Director of Finance for the North Carolina Turnpike Authority and serves as part of the executive management team. Bill Halkias is the President of the International Road Federation, Geneva Program Center based in Switzerland. He's the Managing Director and CEO of the Attica Tollway Operation and Maintenance Company in Athens, Greece. He's also a member of the IBTTA board. Olivier Quoi is the CEO of Atland, He operates and manages the A63 motorway located in the southwest of France, leading to the Spanish border, which has a high level of heavy vehicle traffic. Scott Munroe is a senior director in Fitch Ratings Global Infrastructure and Project Finance Group in San Francisco, where he leads toll road coverage in the US. Jonathan Hart is a principal, senior project manager, and planner for CDM Smith, where he has successfully led multiple projects related to transportation finance and technology. And Jonathan was instrumental in organizing this panel of experts. And last but not least is Matt Bernstein. He's the director in the Transportation Finance Group at Citigroup Global Markets, Inc., where he specializes in providing banking services for a wide range of municipal issuers across the country to finance infrastructure projects. Gentlemen, welcome all of you. It's a delight to have you here. And before anybody asks, I'll acknowledge that, yes, this is an all-male panel, and we at IBTTA are really working hard at diversity. We didn't hit the mark on it on this panel today, but we're working harder and we'll do better next time. So David Roy, you're our first presenter. You have the floor, and please take yourself off mute.
All right. Well, thank you, Pat. Feel free to go ahead and move to the next slide. Again, my name is David Roy. I am the Director of Finance for the North Carolina Turnpike Authority. And on the call with us, I've invited JJ Eden, who is the Executive Director of the authority. I apologize, but I'm going to have to drop a little early from this call. I've been called into another meeting that I can't avoid. So he will be available to answer any questions as we move through today's conversation. So just wanted to briefly kind of touch on where the authority is, as far as it relates to COVID-19 and the impacts that we are seeing, and then just talk briefly about kind of what the approach has been that we have taken to date around forecasting and trying to look to the future. So Pat, feel free to move to the next slide. So the Turnpike Authority here in North Carolina really operates two facilities. The first being the Triangle Expressway in the Raleigh-Durham region, and a newer facility out in the Charlotte area. The Munroe Expressway opened in late 2018. So what we are showing here is the daily traffic volumes that we have seen on both facilities when compared to a period just before we started seeing impacts of COVID-19 in North Carolina. So this is showing traffic volumes on each facility compared to the last week in February. As you can see, through much of March and April on the Triangle Expressway, we saw quite a significant ramp down in traffic volumes. The Triangle Expressway really serves as a commuter facility into the Research Triangle Park, which is a major research hub in the area. A lot of what we would term white-collar jobs. I think we have seen the impact of work from home orders, stay-at-home orders that are in place from the governor's office. Over the last few weeks, we have seen some ramping up on the Triangle Expressway, but certainly not as material as you see on the Munroe Expressway. Here in North Carolina, the governor did begin to lift stay-at-home orders on May 8th. We entered what they've termed phase 1 and anticipate to enter phase 2, which would have more significant changes, I believe, to traffic patterns and mobility on May 22nd is the current target for that. On the Munroe Expressway, we've seen a little different traffic pattern, if you will, as it relates to COVID-19. We saw a much slower ramp down in traffic on that facility. I think due in part to two factors, well, several factors. One being that it is a new facility, so we are still in ramp up and seeing significant month-over-month growth on that facility just because of its kind of newer status, if you will. The second being it is a little less of a strictly commuter facility, more through traffic, truck traffic, which I think other presenters will talk about the bright spots that we've seen in truck volumes throughout this pandemic. So as you can see, on the Munroe Expressway, we've seen volumes of anywhere from 40 to 50%, but it has seen significant ramp up over the last couple of weeks on that facility and almost back to levels that were seen pre-pandemic. Pat, go ahead and switch to the next slide. So I know we were supposed to keep this to 5 minutes, so I will just briefly touch on this, mostly the last bullet there. Some of the efforts that NCTA has undertaken to ease impacts on our customers during this period. Beginning in late March, early April, we suspended all of our third-party collection efforts, as well as our DMV registration holds for past due accounts. And in early April, we also suspended the assessment of any of our fees and fines for non-payments. So I know this conversation is really about looking to the future and how we forecast in this time. NCTA has really taken the approach to date that it is still somewhat early in kind of the life cycle of the impacts that will be felt from this pandemic, and as opposed to trying to make a forecast impacts into the future on specific facilities, we have been doing more sensitivity testing, stress cases, looking to the rating agencies and working closely with our traffic consultants to really get a range of where we feel the potential exists for impacts to be felt into the future, and where our stressors would be as far as liquidity pinch points, coverage considerations, et cetera, and what steps we could take to mitigate those potential impacts, if the kind of catastrophic scenarios do come to fruition. So that's kind of where we're at. Again, as Pat mentioned, happy to take any questions. I think I'm at my 5 minutes, Pat, but happy to take any questions, or we'll be available later, and JJ will be available later as well to answer any questions folks might have.
All right, David, thank you so much. I appreciate your being here, and excellent presentation. Next, we turn to Bill Halkias with the Attica Motorway. Bill, please take yourself off mute, and you have the floor.
Good afternoon, good morning, good night. It all depends which part of the globe you are. Thank you, Pat, and thank you, IBTTA, for being there when we needed most. When we had concerns and when we needed to share experience, things of what to do and what not to do, IBTTA was there. So if you need this line, Pat, to bring in more members, please use it. So without any further ado, I will turn into the next slide and present what we do when we need to forecast traffic in times of uncertainties, as our Brazilian friend pointed out last time that we all gathered together. What you see here is a map of the Athens metropolitan area. The yellow is an east to west and a north to south link of our motorway. It's fully toll. You cannot enter on the road unless you pay toll. So we have 39 toll stations. In each and every entry, you pay a flat toll no matter the distance travel, and that it is to serve as congestion limitation. The next slide, please. So what we do, we're not the experts in predicting and doing traffic modeling, as you will hear later on from the experts of CDM Smith or Fitch rating or whatever. So as traffic engineers, though, we all know that traffic depends, of course, on toll price and the value of time. Other parameters such as vehicle ownership play an important role, population, employment, gasoline price, GDP, all of these factors together. I have a friend, Don Baxter, from TRB Freeway Operations Committee. He used to say, there is a gasoline price out there that solves all of our congestion problems. I will say there is a toll price out there that can do the same thing. So in times of uncertainty, people turn to us. Which people though? Not the Fitch ratings, not the bond holders, but our shareholders who want to have something quick and dirty. So what we have observed here on Attica Tollway, which is the toll road in a major metropolitan area, is that all these parameters that they impact traffic, they come down to one of them, and this is GDP. And we started back in 2005, all the way up to 2019, and we put points of GDP and toll traffic entering our motorway. So we set it back in 2005 into 100, and we kept marking the evolution. So in the early years, between 2005 to 2009, traffic was going up and GDP was going up about evenly, 1-to-1. If traffic was going up 5%, then GDP was going up 5%, traffic was going up by 5.5 or 6%. And then in 2009, and you know that we were the guinea pigs for the Western world, where we had an extensive financial crisis. There were financial crises in many other countries, but didn't last so many years. So between 2009 to 2014, we had constantly losing GDP, constantly going worse and worse. So we kept monitoring this thing, and we observed that the theory is good, that when GDP goes down, traffic goes down, but now this time goes faster. And then in 2015, traffic levels off, and together with that, GDP stopped being reduced. And then slightly GDP went up again. So I was recently asked also by the elector group, chief financial officer, to give them predictions about what is going to happen in this pandemic period over the next years. So what I've done is I went to IMF and EIU and I got predictions about GDP. And I plugged this into this curve and I was able to tie the two together. Of course, scenarios were playing. If GDP in the country is minus 5%, then this is going to happen to traffic. And then as a traffic engineer, I did what everybody else does. I consider that we may not get back into 100% where we were before because of some behavior changes that everybody is expecting. So with this is an empirical model. It's not something which is very scientific, but my friend from Brazil can do something, provided, of course, he has a toll road that has some history. Next slide, please. All right, so here is what we plugged in during the pandemic period. We started at the beginning of March in the country with various measures, closing down initially schools, later on small shops, and then on March 17, we had a complete lockdown. We locked down traveling. You could not travel unless you were fully authorized. And what you see in orange is the 2019 traffic, and in blue, it's the 2020 traffic. Recently, we were allowed again to travel, to go without getting the special permission. So the yellow between the two red lines, the yellow cover area is the difference between 2019 and what is happening today. And since we are now into the second phase of the pandemic, opening up little by little, you see the jump that we had in the blue line, which is up to date, up to yesterday actually. And we do hope that with the opening of all these other activities, we'll get back into more normal, but still less than the normal situation. Thank you very much all. And again, thank you IBTTA for the opportunity.
Bill, thank you so much for that excellent presentation and for being with us today. Our next presenter is Olivier Quoi. Olivier, please take yourself off mute and you have the floor.
Thank you, Pat. Hello, everybody, and thanks very much for the invitation. I will speak about on A63, which is a motorway in the southwest part of France, as Pat explained, which is linking Spain and Portugal to the north and east of Europe. The two main parts of the traffic is for us freight, since trucks accounts for 2/3 of our revenues, and of course leisure traffic, especially during the summer. If we go to the next slide, Pat, we can see the effects of COVID-19 measures impact. You have the before photograph on the left-hand side and after on the right-hand side. You see that contrary to what Bill showed, we are really a weekend and leisure motorway for cars. So the peaks were expected more during weekends. You see Easter, for instance, for which we expected a high level of cars, and of course there was not any. And for trucks, the traffic was far reduced, but still remained quite important. If we go to the next slide, before doing any calculation, the idea to try to get insight on forecasts was analyzing vehicle trends based on trip purpose analysis. And I can share some of our insights, of course, which can be discussed. So the work purpose is the last one with only 10% of the traffic. On this one, we can expect a reduction because work at home will have an impact, and probably the shift from transit will be compensated by maybe less carpooling. On professional move, which accounts for 30% of the overall car traffic, their work at home can play a role and probably reduce a bit this amount of traffic. The last part is the main one, with tourism and leisure, which accounts for 60% of the traffic, with the short stay during weekends and the long stay for summer. And of course, at the moment, we are really focusing on the summer because summer accounts for approximately half of the yearly traffic. And for this summer, what we can say is that we will probably have, we expect, maybe a slight positive effect on resulting from air transport reduction with a shift to road. The main part will probably be the catering availability, which is the supply for tourism, and maybe a price effect, which can be benefit for us because we are in an area where you have a lot of campings and a lot of quite easy accessible holidays and facilities. And of course, destination, the main issue being border closure and eventually distance limitations. So the French Prime Minister announced that normally things should be reopening, and probably distance limits will be cancelled. So we could be a bit optimistic. The European Commission announced a few days ago that they were working on border opening and maybe corridor settings. So if we go to some figures in the next slide, Pat, please. The idea was to reuse an old traffic model, which is basically 4 steps modeling. And the interest is that we can play, of course, I say play because it's not real engineering, but we can force the mode choice to try to evaluate the shifts from air to road, for instance, and also play on distribution and generation, playing on catering availability, which is basically the attraction factor, and the distance limitations, or even simulating border closing. Playing with that, of course, in the worst case, where the distance restriction is still on and you have border closure, etc., we will have almost no traffic, minus 90%. But in other cases, we see that the air shift could compensate, at least partially, border closure or limitation in catering, which could account for minus 20 or minus 30%. I would not show any optimistic scenario in which we could have even more traffic than the other years, because I'm not really comfortable with that. But the initial overall expectation is about minus 50. And last, next slide, please. On heavy goods vehicle, we can rely on the same assumption that Bill showed, because the link with the GDP statistics is quite well established. And in our case, playing with the same figure as Bill, we could end with a minus 11% for 2020 overall traffic. Of course, question being the industry relocations or harbors traffic, and maybe cost rise as well. And that's it. I will be available for any question. Thank you very much.
Olivier, thank you very much. Excellent presentation. And I would remind our participants, our guests, that the chat function is live. If you have a question, you can pose it to the speakers and they can respond now. And we'll also have time for questions at the end of all the presentations. Well, now I'm pleased to turn the program over to Scott Munroe. Please take yourself off mute.
Thanks, Pat, and thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, even if just remotely. So in the wake of the health crisis, Fitch has been in communication with all 60 of its rated toll roads. That includes both publicly rated and privately rated toll roads. We've also been in touch with major toll road equity sponsors, traffic and revenue consultancies, and based on these communications, we found that the typical light vehicle traffic loss peaked at about 50 to 60%, and the typical managed lane traffic loss peaked at about 60 to 70%. Now, just to put these losses into perspective, the median peak to trough losses during the Great Recession were about 7% for large networks and 14% for small networks. That would indicate that the current loss rates are roughly 5 times higher than a period that had already been viewed as an outlier for its severity. The bright spot so far during the coronavirus crisis has been truck traffic, which was down just 10 to 15% at its peak. Now, data over the past few weeks suggests facilities are recovering gradually from these peak losses, but they do remain vulnerable to the extent that recently eased stay-at-home orders are tightened, particularly if hospitals are overwhelmed again. So in light of these findings, Fitch crafted 2 cash flow scenarios addressing a significant range of potential economic outcomes. And we completed our review of every toll road credit in April. Now, considering the severity of the revenue losses under Fitch's assumptions, some may be surprised by the results of our review. So 79% of the rating outcomes were affirmations of the existing ratings with stable outlooks, while 18% were affirmations of the existing ratings, but with negative outlook revisions. Of the portfolio, only 1 credit was downgraded, and another was put on rating watch negative. So the sector's relative stability stems first and foremost from a strong liquidity position. The lion's share of toll road credits have solid unrestricted cash reserves. They have healthy debt service coverage ratios and debt service reserve accounts that are typically sized to about 1 year's worth of debt service. So as a result of this, the vast majority of credits were deemed to possess sufficient liquidity to weather even the most severe revenue losses, as long as those losses were time limited, as we project the health crisis to be. But transitioning away from the liquidity side of things, our sector analysis and focus on out-year financial performance once toll roads establish a new revenue baseline, which we project will occur around 2021 to 2022. Excuse me. Most toll roads withstood the projected revenue decline without substantial financial impairment, leading to the significant proportion of affirmations and stable outlooks. However, about 20% of the facilities triggered negative sensitivities that led to mostly negative outlooks. Now, the reason most negative activity resulted in negative outlooks and not downgrades is twofold. First, we acknowledge that the parameters of the new cases were crafted early in the crisis, and it does remain to be seen whether economic activity may bounce back faster than our cases are now projecting. But secondly, many toll roads benefit from substantial rate-making flexibility. So should policymakers decide to raise rates to offset revenue losses, as many did in the Great Recession, then some outlooks could return to stable, even if traffic ultimately disappoints. Perhaps the most surprising outcome of the portfolio review was that managed lanes had the least amount of negative rating actions, with 12 of 13 credits affirmed with stable outlooks and just 1 placed on negative outlook. And their strong performance stems from a number of factors that too numerous to note in detail right now, given the limited time. But broadly, their outperformance stemmed from the common use of things like deferrable TIPIA debt structures. So many debt structures currently are under capitalized interest or interest accretion mode or interest only mode. And typically managed lanes have high coverage levels compared to standard toll roads at the same rating level. So looking to the future, sector performance will hinge on a number of important variables. Arguably the most influential is the pace with which the health crisis will be resolved and the timing and degree to which economic activity will rebound, with knock-on implications for traffic levels. Fitch's economists project that U.S. GDP will contract severely this year by about 5.6%, and that next year will experience only a partial recovery, which of course does not bode well for traffic levels through next year. On the other hand, There are a number of levers that toll road operators may pull to help offset traffic declines, and these include things like rate hikes. And while raising tolls during the health crisis is impractical, if not politically impossible, for many toll roads, policymakers will have an opportunity to review rates once the immediate crisis has passed, as was done during the Great Recession. On the cost side, variable costs, largely in the form of toll collections, will fall automatically, and operators additionally may find opportunities to cut fixed costs. Capital plans may be revisited with projects likely to be deferred or scaled back, especially growth-related ones. And finally, some toll roads may restructure their debt by pushing near-term debt out, providing them with near-term flexibility and taking advantage of the underlying and enduring strengths of these core infrastructure assets. And I'm going to stop here, but we'll be happy to take any questions during our Q&A. Thank you.
Scott, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. Our next presenter is Jonathan Hart. Please remember to take yourself off mute. Jonathan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Pat. Good morning to everybody. It's great to see everybody. You forget how nice it is to see friends and colleagues until you don't have it. Pat, if you can advance to the next slide. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on data. We've seen a lot of really great data so far, and I think we all have a pretty good sense now of what's going on. We've settled into something of a stable situation where we've bottomed out with pretty remarkable similarity across the board. You'll see that we're between 40 and 50% with about 6% standard deviation. What I want to talk most about is that first part of the curve there, where it's just plummeting. Because in the early days of the crisis, we didn't have data, or rather we had data on a day-by-day basis, and all we saw was it dropping precipitously. And we had no idea how it would play out. It wasn't too long ago when large-scale quarantines were fairly scary rumors. And a few weeks later, they were our reality. So in those first few weeks, our main concern was with trying to determine where the bottom might be and what we were looking at. We weren't so concerned in that moment with forecasting the situation long term. Obviously, we wanted to know what was going on, but the situation was still too fluid and unknowable. And the problem was so vast and overwhelming that the first order of business was really to step back and to try to put some numbers to it, to make this something that was tangible, quantifiable. So we started developing some scenarios to help define the boundaries of uncertainty, starting with scenarios of a short-lived stay-at-home order followed by rapid recoveries. Unfortunately, those scenarios pretty quickly fell out as being impossible. To these long-term quarantines with really massive economic losses, massive losses in jobs. These are scenarios that in my original models were called to things like impossible and absurd and other things that I won't mention. Again, those quickly became our baseline. But again, they stabilized, and really since that second week, we haven't changed our basic framework all that much. So how do we start to put numbers to this? Where would you even start to try to assess something that's completely unprecedented? Rather than looking at the event itself, rather than looking at a global pandemic and the subsequent national, international and national response, we focused on the resulting behavior. Could we identify what people were doing, how they were acting, and could we find functionally similar events that might grant us some insight into how things would unfold? We felt strongly in the near term, the economics weren't where we should be focusing. Obviously, there are some economic realities here that are frightening and very substantial. But limitations on mobility, closure of places of businesses, ultimately school closures would have such a massive impact on traffic that the underlying economic impacts would be completely masked. Even if places of business remained open, school closures would have a knock-on effect. BLS says as of 2019, 64% of the households with children had both parents working. So those kids are now home. So even employed or not, regardless of how business is going, that's going to have some effect on you. So what precedents did we have for this type of behavior? What else did this look like? What keeps kids home from school and closes businesses? Obviously, that varies regionally. We looked at weather events, heavy snow, extreme cold, flooding, hurricanes. In the New York City market, we looked at 9/11 in the immediate aftermath. And in each major market, we were able to find some parallel or comparable event. And these extreme events established what was our floor. While each market is unique, we estimated that we'd see losses around 45% on average. Whether we did a particularly good job at that time or just got lucky, that turned out to be a really solid number. And that's where most of us find ourselves today, in this middle range. So the question is now that we have this data, now that we've seen some stability, what do we do going forward? With respect to the quarantine, early estimates we adopted, we're looking at a July lifting of the quarantine. It started off as a safe, if not extreme estimate, and it's looking more and more like a certainty. We hope we don't have to revise that assumption, but again, we have not had to change these basic parameters in probably 6 weeks now. Our biggest unknowns going forward are the possibility of a resurgent outbreak, the availability of a vaccine, or at least an effective treatment. And these are really the things that we need to keep an eye on. But what's our next parallel? We have these parallel catastrophic events. Our next parallel, we're looking at the Great Recession, obviously, and how the economic realities that time shaped behavior in our travel habits. Again, the metrics are good, but we want to look at the effect on behavior. So the one thing that we learned from the recession was that economic indicators alone simply didn't paint the whole picture. Those events shaped outlooks and attitudes that continue to this day. And it would be short-sighted to think that what we're experiencing now, even once it's over, won't have long-lasting societal impacts. So we need to consider, what will this event catalyze? Will it mean accelerated adoption of work from home? And will that even mean fewer trips? That's a possibility. But what about public transit and lasting aversion to crowded public spaces? That could result in more trips. So it's not so simple as any one trend. And I'm always very cautious of adopting anything that looks like or is called a trend. There's no one trend or prediction that holds the answer. So we need to look beyond the numbers and consider, who will we be when this is over? Who will our customers be when this is over? And how will this affect us in the long run? With that, I'd like to hand it back to Pat.
Thanks, Jonathan. Much appreciated all your work in organizing this session, and thanks for a great presentation. Our last presenter is Matt Bernstein. Matt, please take yourself off mute, and you have the floor.
Thanks, Pat. Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Bernstein with Citigroup, and I'll be providing some thoughts on the U.S. municipal market for toll issuers. Prior to the pandemic and the Great Shutdown in mid-March, the municipal debt markets, both tax-exempt and taxable, were experiencing historically low interest rates, low credit spreads, and the toll sector had a healthy forward calendar of new money and refunding transactions across the credit spectrum from AA to BBB credits. Then from March 9th to March 20th, disruptions from this global health crisis caused a 2-week shutdown in the primary municipal market. Since the primary market is reopened, interest rates have trended back near historically low levels, but the current opportunity for issuers to access capital has narrowed to those credits with high credit ratings, A category and higher, and at higher credit spreads. Interestingly, we have not seen a single toll revenue bond transaction price since the market reopened in late March. From our underwriters' perspective, there is investor interest and capacity for AA and A category toll revenue bonds at attractive all-in levels. However, there are a couple offsetting factors keeping toll transactions from entering the market at this time. First, the market has been extremely volatile, and issuers with interest rate sensitive transactions like refundings have put deals on hold until savings targets have been achieved. Now, to illustrate this point, on March 9th, the 30-year tax-exempt benchmark as represented by MMD was at a 1.38%. 2 weeks later, that 30-year rate had increased by 144% to a 3.37%. And today it's come back down by 44% from the high to a 1.90. So an extraordinary amount of interest rate movement in a short period of time for our market. Second, market participants have increased their financial strength heading into this crisis. Since the Great Recession, many toll issuers enacted rate increases and policies that boosted liquidity, which have offset some of the revenue losses to date. A Moody's report from March of this year cited median liquidity levels at 914 days cash on hand in 2018 for the toll credits that they rate. Since the financial crisis, banks have also been in a better position to extend balance sheet, which provides another avenue for toll agencies to manage their debt without needing to access the capital markets. Next, as traffic continues to rebound nationwide, many are anxious to see what Congress might provide by way of revenue replacement. The COVID stimulus bills that have been enacted and proposed do not provide direct funding for toll agencies. Congress has been reluctant to provide new funding programs for states and local governments, and the aid that has been provided to date has largely been channeled through existing grants, programs, and formulas, and there isn't an analog for toll agencies in the US. However, we remain hopeful that Congress can address this important revenue replacement request when they reconvene in person. Disclosing COVID-related financial information has also been challenging given the rapid pace of change and uncertainty regarding these projections. The SEC recently released a public statement encouraging municipal issuers to disclose material information related to the impacts of COVID on their financial and operating conditions. The SEC statement provides guidance on voluntary disclosure related to the virus, but does not alter or amend existing laws to require municipal issuers to do so. That said, several toll issuers have previously made or are planning to make COVID voluntary disclosures, and others are preparing transactions for the market that will include, said disclosure. We do expect that many of our toll clients will ultimately provide some disclosure to the market given the amount of time that's passed and the information that's available. Finally, forecasting. Our prior panel has detailed several of the approaches we're seeing the industry take to forecasting toll traffic in this environment. Despite the uncertainty and the factors that typically affect traffic growth for toll agencies, it has been encouraging to see initial forecasts and scenarios arrive at a generally consistent range of possible outcomes, particularly with regards to near-term activity and recovery patterns for 2020 and 2021. Ultimately, I think municipal market participants understand that these challenges are temporary and that toll agencies are taking a judicious approach in developing their debt strategies and return to the capital market. Thank you.
Matt, thank you so much for your excellent presentation. And we are going to turn now to questions. And I have a question for all of the agency folk who are on this, our presenters, David Roy, and I guess we'll defer to JJ Eden, who's taking JJ's place because David had to leave, Bill Halkias and Olivier. I'd like to hear what specific preparations you're making to respond, to prepare yourselves financially in the next 6 to 12 months. So I pose that to JJ, to Olivier, and to Bill.
I could start, I guess, Pat. We're taking a really strong look at budgets for one thing. Also, we're trying to project where traffic is going. We have a really big difference between our two projects. Munroe is up to almost 90% of its traffic in February, where the Raleigh project is only running about 45%. So we're in the process of doing a streaming look with the company called Wejo, to similar to what they did in Georgia, to see what where traffic's going and how each phase of the recovery impacts that traffic movement so we can adjust our numbers. We're also looking at the potential with the interest rates down of some potential refinancing on that side. So, but the bigger deal is we're really going to tighten our belts, not only around the budget side, but also on the capital side.
Thanks, JJ. Bill Halkias or Olivier.
All right, if I may. As I said initially, Pat, we were the guinea pigs. We had a slide in financial activity for 5 or 6 years, and therefore we have learned our lesson well way back. So controlling cost is the main principle in this thing. And since we are labor incentive business, more than 50% of our expenses is personnel. We're trying to find ways where we can control the cost, either by encouraging additional ETC traffic. Now, during this pandemic period, we were at about 50% and we reached 65% ETC. So ETC for us is something which is major. Also, investing in technology. Rather than having patrols going all over the place, we start looking into drones and cameras and doing the work like this way. And last but not least, you have subcontractors in times of financial difficulties and this kind of activities. There is a rebid of many subcontracts, and you get same lower price with same quality of service. So all three items together end up into one: control your cost.
Bill, thank you very much. Yeah, good message about controlling costs. And I'm going to turn to Olivier to see if you have a response to this about preparations you're making for the next 6 to 12 months.
Yes, thanks, Pat. Of course, expenses are one part, and we try to optimize all expenses regarding renewal specifically. But we also have taxes, which are quite significant in France. And we need to recalculate some of them because taxes are paid most of the time based on the outcome of the previous year. So of course, when 2019 was a good year, we have quite a large amount of taxes that are due and that are calculated, but we are going to recalculate them, and the state is open to that. We also have set up a close cash follow-up because our main expenses will be debt repayment. We still have about 700 million euro debt, so that's quite important. But for the moment, things should be okay for June the 30th. Not so easy, but and then after that, we will mainly rely on traffic recovery, at least for a minimum. So, and last, I would say our main concern will be to be flexible. You mentioned the summer traffic, for instance. The question is the overall traffic, but also peak traffic, because probably we expect not so much on overall, but maybe we can have high peaks of traffic, and we will have to be flexible on that.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Carlos Santillan, who typed a question in the chat, but I want to give him a chance to ask it orally. So Carlos, you're up.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. I don't want to sound unsensible, but this epidemic really didn't hit neither the infrastructure, it wasn't an earthquake, or the bridges or the tunnels. It didn't hit the equipment. It hit, sadly, to our people. So shouldn't it be quick to come back from it and easy to come back? I don't want to sound naive neither, but I think that I want to think it's a long and sad weekend from which we're coming from, and maybe it's easy to come back. Thank you.
Carlos, thanks for your excellent question. And I'm going to turn to our analysts. Matt, Scott, if Jonathan, if you'd like to respond to that.
Sure, Pat. I'll just go ahead and delete the long reply I was typing up. Carlos, I agree with you. Certainly initially, what we were looking at was the impact of the stay-at-home order. This wasn't the Great Recession. There were not, and certainly Matt and Scott may disagree with this, but I don't think that we had systemic structural underlying economic problems. So initially, if this were to end early on, I think it would have snapped back pretty quickly, and it still has the the possibility of snapping back faster than if this were something that were resulting from a structural problem with the economy. But the longer this goes on, the more people that lose their jobs, the more demand falls for goods, the more businesses shut down and won't be able to return. That damage does become lasting. So the longer this goes on, the harder it's going to be to recover. I hope that helps somewhat, but you know, I'm not as optimistic as I once was that we could come back from this quickly. But again, you know, it doesn't take quite as long to restaff things as it does to bring demand back. So,
thanks, Jonathan. Scott Munroe, your thoughts?
I have some concerns about where the world is now as compared to where we were during the Great Recession in terms of debt as a percentage of GDP, in terms of interest rates. It seems to me that there may be less firepower available for governments to combat the economic crisis that we're entering into now than we did many years ago. And kind of along the lines of what Jonathan was saying, that the more prolonged this is, you know, we're already starting to see a lot of Main Street businesses go bankrupt. JCPenney, I think was Neiman Marcus, one of those mom and pop type of restaurants and so forth, are either going out of business, accumulating debt, whether it's household debt or small business debt or large corporation or governmental debt. So I suspect that this is going to be prolonged, and Fitch is taking the view that it may be prolonged as well, which is why we're not only considering cash flow cases that would envision potentially a very severe shock, but we're also setting up cash flow cases that will consider a very prolonged and weak recovery, where we might not be back to 2019 levels until about 2024.
All right, thank you very much. Any of our analysts want to rebut or add to that response?
This is Matt. I would agree with everything that Jonathan and Scott said. You know, some things that we've seen that have been a little interesting have been, you know, the trough at which some issuers are recalculating their forecasts have been revised for the positive. I think, you know, if you start from the position that traffic is down 60% versus 50% when things reopen, you know, that tends to have a benefit. You know, seen some questions about second waves. You know, I've heard some discussion from folks that, you know, their thoughts that, you know, there will likely probably be some second wave, but the healthcare industry and infrastructure that's been built up is better equipped to handle it this time than what happened clearly the first time a couple of weeks ago or several months ago. So, you know, I think that's encouraging as well, that, you know, we're not going to hopefully see another quarantine and lockdown, that folks are preparing for a second wave. Infrastructure is in place to largely deal with that, and, you know, that can be maintained to the best it you know, now that folks have advance notice, I guess.
Matt, thank you very much. Here's an interesting question from Toshi Shepard Ota. How are you taking into consideration the shift away from transit and carpool due to social distancing capacity limitations? Also shifts to working from home. Matt, Jonathan, Scott, either of you?
I reply through the chat.
Oh, okay.
One quick way for us is to go on our toll stations and do quick surveys. And in case of open road tolling, go with polling. There is no other way to just find out how many people shifted from other modes of traffic, or if they do teleworking. With most of us, though, we having customers that we know their habits. They are ETC subscribers of ours. You know, a good sample, 100, 200 people will give us a quick way. If you want to know exactly what happens, then you go to 4-step modeling and put everything together. But a quick way to do that is by polling.
Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, Pat, we've seen a huge impact on transit, in some cases in excess of 95%. So clearly, transit, which is primarily geared towards your daily commuters, is being hit much harder. In the US, that mode share is still relatively small, though. So even if all of those folks did shift to single occupancy vehicles, It would be, certainly it would have an effect, but I don't know how large and noticeable it would be. As for working from home, that's something I don't think any of us can predict. I do believe it will accelerate things a bit. We've looked in the past, well before this happened, at the revenue risk to toll facilities of a work from home environment. And you know, at its maximum, it could account for maybe 2% revenue loss, possibly more, but that's where we wound up, 2 to 4%. So we could see that accelerated, certainly, but I don't know that we're going to see a large-scale societal shift. And in many ways, we're creatures of habit, and we tend to return to the norm as quickly as we can.
Thanks, Jonathan. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. At Fitch, we are entertaining the possibility there could be a permanent and upward shift of telecommuting, but the percentage of telecommuters as it stands today who do so on a regular basis, excluding the crisis, is less than 1%. So even if you had a doubling of that, you're really not talking about a particularly sizable loss, especially taken in the context of kind of long-term traffic gains on most systems, which are in the low single digits. So there could be a small and permanent shift down in traffic levels, but we wouldn't expect it to be especially material from a financial perspective.
Thank you, Scott. There's a couple of questions about the transition from cash to all electronic tolling. There's a question about how to preserve your credit ratings in this environment. And there's also a question about sort of getting at the mobility as a service. Do any of you expect toll companies to take advantage of new services supplied in the mobility market and new post-COVID opportunities? So there's 3 questions I put out for all of our panelists, if you'd like to respond to any one of them. Cash to AET, credit ratings, preserving them, and mobility as a service, shifts there. What do you think, panel?
Oliver?
Well, we already have a very high level of electronic toll collection for trucks, more than 95%. So it's not really a question. For us, the main question will be during the summer. It's the only period of the year when we put people in the toll booth. And in France, for the moment, cash is required. So it's not so easy. We saw with great interest some US toll collection that removed fully cash, but we can't do that for the moment. So we need to keep them for the moment.
All right.
In our case in Athens spot, we have lifting bars up and down. And we did close down all customer service areas so that people could not come in. So without doing anything, we had a jump in the ETC from 50% to 65%. Just people were afraid of handing over cash or credit cards or any kind of other means of payment to toll collectors. So it's people behavior in this case.
Thanks, Bill. Oh, Jonathan, it looks like you're trying to speak, but you're on mute. Go ahead, Jonathan.
That might be preferable for some. We've seen a lot of operators in the US temporarily shift to all electronic toll collection. I don't know that will cause an immediate shift, because the type of all electronic toll collection we're seeing right now is lacking certain features, certain enforcement features, certain customer service features. But I do believe that it will catalyze some changes in the industry. This could happen again, and one of the things that as an industry we need to do is prepare ourselves for where we are next time something like this happens. And unfortunately for the toll collectors, that means protecting our revenue, and that means creating a stronger and more robust all electronic toll collection environment. So I do think you'll see some acceleration in that regard.
Thanks, Jonathan. Anybody else in the panel want to respond to any of those collection of issues? Scott?
Sure. There's a question about how do you preserve your credit rating through a crisis like this, and there's a lot you can't control, but there are some aspects that are under operators' control. So one of those is containing costs. Of course, variable O&M is going to fall automatically, but to the extent that you can identify areas to cut back on fixed costs, that can help. Revisiting of capital plans it could also help to the extent that maybe you're anticipating that there's going to be a lot of growth, and you had a lot of growth-related CapEx, the type of they will come kind of projects. You may want to revisit those, but potentially to scale those back or to push them off. And then on the debt side, there is an opportunity here to push back some of your near-term debt if you needed some breathing room. We understand that these are long-term assets that contain a lot of value. So if there were to be a pushing off of debt over the next couple of years, say out to the long end of the debt spectrum, that could provide you with the breathing room you need to weather this downturn in revenue.
Thank you, Scott. Well, we've just about, we're a little bit over our time here, and I want to be respectful of everybody who's on the call, the 83 participants who stayed here through the bitter end. Thank you very much. I want to say thanks to our excellent presenters, David Roy, Bill Halkias, Olivier Quoi, Scott Munroe, Jonathan Hart, Matt Bernstein. Thanks to the entire international committee led by Malika Sethi, our international vice president, soon to be General Secretary of ASICAP. I also want to let you know, please watch the IBTTA website and tune in for future webinars and meetups like this. The next one is scheduled for next Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. It's our Cafe IBTTA, 30 minutes of jovial conversation. And our guest next week is going to be Carrie Witt, a past president of IBTTA, now with HNTB. So please stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Great team. Thank you all.
Thanks,
Well
everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you.